For those not familiar with the extremist conspiracy theory known as QAnon, it's actually hard to believe the lengths to which its followers will go, including the kind of violence perpetrated on the U.S. Capitol last January 6, 2021. A new book lays it out, written by Mia Bloom and Sofia Moskalenko. It's called Pastels and Pedophiles: Inside the Mind of QAnon. Mia Bloom is a communications professor at Georgia State University, a member of the Evidence-Based Cybersecurity Research Group, and she joins us now from Atlanta, Georgia. And it's so good to see you again. Mia, you've been on our program a couple of times before, and it's great to see you again. How are you managing?
I'm managing okay. I'm doubly vaxxed, I'm boosted, and I'm isolating. So I'm handling the pandemic well, and I have the liquid substance behind me to help.
That's essential to get you through it too, I guess. Yes, as much as the vaccines. Well, it's great to see you again. Let me just start. I'm going to read an excerpt here from early in your book, which essentially, sets the table for the discussion to come here. And I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, if he wouldn't mind bringing up this graphic, and away we go. QAnon is a baseless conspiracy theory from the darkest underbelly of the internet, you write. Named after the Department of Energy's highest level of security clearance, a Q clearance is related to access to nuclear weapons designs, but not to other national security concerns. The conspiracy conceives that former President Trump is fighting a battle against a deep state cabal of Democratic saboteurs who worship Satan and traffic children for sex or for their blood. Okay. That's what it's about. Now, maybe we could start by having you take us back to October 2017. There was an anonymous post on 4chan. That's one of those alt-right message boards. What's the story there?
So beginning in October 2017, what you have is someone starts posting on 4chan what they called Q drops, these cryptic hints of predictions or other statements. The first October 2017 one predicted that Hillary Clinton was about to be arrested. And of course, none of this was true. None of it, I'd say probably 99.99 of all the QAnon predictions, of which there were over 4,700 Q drops over the course from October 2017 until the 2020 election, what you have is almost nothing ever came true. And then, of course, the one time that maybe the QAnon message boards were accurate breathes life into the conspiracy that argues that, well, everything is true, it just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I well remember, I think, just Joe Biden was putting his hand on the Bible to be sworn in as the next president of the United States. There was a QAnon prediction saying something will happen. The inauguration won't take place. Trump will, march in on a white stallion and be re-inaugurated as president. And none of this stuff ever comes true. And yet somehow they manage to maintain the loyalty of their membership. How do they do it?
Well, we've seen some fluctuations, and it's very likely that had we not had lockdowns in March of 2020, we probably would have seen this QAnon conspiracy peter out quite a bit. The popularity of the conspiracy was relatively flat from October 2017 until right before the spread of COVID-19 and also the lockdowns that accompanied March 2020. What then happened as a result of the lockdowns is we saw an uptick in QAnon activity, people posting about it, people using their hashtags, up 600% according to the Wall Street Journal. So what you have then is that there's an intricate relationship between COVID-19 and QAnon. And so as well, we see this intersectionality between QAnon and people who are anti-vaccine, people who argue that the election was stolen, people who argue that Anthony Fauci is deliberately trying to create a new world order. There is a lot of conspiracies that are now subsumed under the QAnon umbrella that previously would have operated independently. And so what's interesting about QAnon is that it has managed to bring under its fold conspiracies that pre-existed it by almost 20 years. So within QAnon, you have people who also believe in lizard people, that are alien race trying to take over the world by pretending to be us, but secretly are lizards, that the earth is flat, that the moon landing was faked. In other words, all of the various conspiracy theories previously that never really talked to each other are now all welcome to this big tent conspiracy of QAnon.
At the top of the QAnon pyramid, of course, is allegedly somebody who goes by the moniker of Q. Is anybody any closer to figuring out who this mystery person is?
Well, so there's a bunch of different schools of thought. The argument that Sophia and I made in the book, I was allowed to quote my very favorite movie, The Princess Bride, where you remember the dread pirate Roberts, that it's not the same person, but it's the name that really invoked terror. We suspect very strongly that between October 2017 until 2020, there were different people at different times posting as Q. Now, two different documentaries spent years tracking down who might be QAnon. The HBO documentary decided that it was Ron Watson, Jim Watson's son, who was the owner of 8chan. The Vice News also had a documentary that really didn't come to a conclusion, but introduced a variety of different characters who might have been QAnon at different times. For someone like Jim Swartzen, who's a QAnon expert, he seems to think it links back to General Michael Flynn. So depending on who you talk to, I think what's really important to know is that it's very likely that when HBO began its production to try to track down who QAnon was, flying all over the globe and in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, that maybe unmasking who QAnon was would have been the way to undermine it. But what's happened is that most people who subscribe to this belief system no longer care who the persona of QAnon is. And in fact, they no longer even call themselves QAnon.
Well, I guess this would be interesting, but not necessarily important, if not for the fact that there are apparently a number of people now on Capitol Hill in the United States, in Washington, D.C., who are followers of QAnon and who have managed to get themselves elected. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
And this is, again, terrifying. And on the one hand, I have to thank Twitter, and if Jack is still in charge, for deplatforming Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was a terrible source of disinformation about COVID-19 and the vaccine. But in 2020, in the summer of 2020, when the Americans have their primaries, there were 97 candidates running for office that believed in QAnon. Of those 97, 22 went forward to the November election, and 2 were elected, Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia, as well as Lauren Boebert in Colorado. And these 2 women have really, as freshman congresspeople, made a name for themselves with the outrageous and racist and Islamophobic comments that they have made. They have been really a source of terrible disinformation, as well as we're seeing for the 2022 American election, even more candidates now that subscribe to QAnon and will be running for 2022.
Mia, you have to help us Canadians understand this, because I know that if a politician in Canada, where QAnon is not a thing the way it is in the United States, I know if they came forward, as Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, did, and said the forest fires in California were started by Jewish lasers from space, I mean, she'd be laughed out of the country. Down there, it was taken very seriously. What's going on in the United States specifically that allows this kind of craziness to take hold?
Well, first of all, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Canada is in the top 5 countries where QAnon has spread. And you know that there was even an attempt against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So there have been QAnon people and supporters in Canada. So you've got Canada, Australia, Germany, the United States, even Indonesia. One of the things we talked about in the book is that it has spread to 85 different countries. But let me go back for a second. I think what happens is, as I gave you the 97 candidates that turned into 22, 22 out of the 24, there were 2 independents, but they were mostly Republicans. And I think that the Republican Party, which has very poor leadership under Kevin McCarthy, have been very reticent to come out against QAnon because QAnon supporters are sort of their base. And they are among their strongest supporters, their most reliable voters. And because the Republican Party cares more about being in power and retaking the House and the Senate, they are not about to alienate a large group of supporters who would support President Trump and who are also, spouting things that make most Republicans quite uncomfortable. Marjorie Taylor Greene at some point likened wearing the mask in public to Jews wearing the yellow star during the period of Nazi Germany, when the Germans made Jews wear a star and gay people had to wear a pink star. And there were all these different stars for all the groups that the Nazis persecuted. And the only reason she apologized and then made some sort of trip to the Holocaust Museum was because the Republicans said, you're going to lose Jewish financial support to the Republican Party. So at the end of the day, the Republicans, you think that there's no bottom, that there's no point at which Republicans are willing to say, you've gone too far. We've seen this with Greene's argument about Jewish space lasers. We saw this also. Boebert made horrible accusations against a Muslim member of Congress. The things that they say, both privately and publicly, the original, sort of the traditional Republican Party would have been absolutely outraged. And I think that comes out a little bit in some of the statements we've seen by Liz Cheney and other Republicans who have broken with the party to basically have their ethics and their principles against this kind of craziness and hatred.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think one of the most interesting things I learned from your book is that there's, an assumption that QAnon supporters must be overwhelmingly uneducated, overwhelmingly rural, overwhelmingly out of touch with reality. But in fact, your book paints a very different kind of a picture of who's in QAnon. You want to help us with that?
This perhaps was one of the things that were surprising, but Sophia and I have both studied terrorist organizations, between the two of us probably for 50 years. And so I guess I should have known better. I think part of what I was thinking is you had sort of this poor white uneducated class. Remember, President Trump once said, I love the uneducated, because of course the uneducated voted for him. One of the things that became clear is that a lot of women, in particular, who believed in QAnon were women who were successful. They were business owners. One woman even had a master's degree from Harvard University. And so this is really not sort of the stereotypical, low-hanging fruit. And again, you can make a similarity to many of the terrorist groups, that it wasn't only uneducated ex-convicts who joined ISIS. You had people who were doctors or lawyers or engineers. And so I think that it's important that we understand that, first of all, there's no profile for a terrorist, and there's no one profile for someone who believes in QAnon. But there isn't even a political profile, because when the Washington Post last year, around the time of the insurrection or the failed insurrection, did a survey, what they found was 6% of people who believe that there is a blood drinking cabal run by Democrats and Hollywood elites trying to undermine Trump, 6% of those people that said yes identified as Democrats. So we may even see that there are people who are not just Republicans that support this idea, although it is sort of an uneven, it's disproportionate. It's probably around 30 to 33% of Republicans also subscribe to many of the most insane ideas of QAnon.
And why would it appeal, in your view, to so many women?
I think that QAnon was very capable, whoever was running this, and Jim Swartzen, for example, thinks it's a psychological operation. They were very adept at making people, and particularly women, feel that this was the only way that they could save the children. So in 2020, there was a hashtag campaign hashtag Save the Children that was on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And what this did was it pulled in a lot of women. And the question that QAnon was asking is, do you want to save the children? And the answer for most women is always going to be yes. But remember, Steve, I also study ISIS. And that is exactly the way that ISIS appealed to women. Did you want to save the orphans in Syria? So I think what this does is it appeals to women on a very basic level, but it also pulls people in, not because you're some white racist, I hate the Jews, I hate people of color, and so you join QAnon. It's bringing in people who think that they're coming from a place of altruism. I actually joined QAnon and fell down the rabbit hole because I was trying to help people. I really was worried about trafficking. I couldn't believe what was going on with Weinstein and Epstein and Woody Allen and all these horrible people in Hollywood. And so they take a tiny grain of truth, which is what's going to pull in an educated person. But then once you get pulled down the rabbit hole, the consumption of the QAnon material and the propaganda has this effect of convincing you that it's worse than you ever thought, that the conspiracy runs deeper than you ever believed. And so because I'm on their channels and I'm on Telegram monitoring what they say, I see what they see. And you know what? It's really traumatizing. It creates an echo chamber of radicalization that we've seen with jihadi groups and we've seen with racist white nationalist groups.
You know, I've always wanted to ask you, given how much time, because of your professional interests, how much time you spend with some of the more nefarious people in our society, whether you ever worry about, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but whether you ever worry about your own mental health. You hang out with a lot of bad actors to do the work that you do. You ever concerned about your own mental health?
You know, the mental health issue was something that we had to take very seriously because when we were working on this Department of Defense grant on ISIS, the material that we were exposed to, me and my research team, the grad students, there were a lot of beheadings. There were a lot of really horrific images. And so we actually created a protocol. Well, first of all, not more than 2 hours at a time for the students, not before bed. Go out, take a walk. I mean, it's some of the things that we also know interrupt radicalization is even just going outside and separating yourself from your electronic devices. But we had protocols in place. For me, and this is going to sound, I'm not trying to be trivial, I had to stop watching The Walking Dead, and I had to stop watching any kinds of horror movies because as I was looking through the materials from ISIS, I had this little switch in my brain that would say, it's fake, it's fake. It's like in the movies. But I couldn't then watch horror movies and then have that frame of comparison. So I did, it affected me in small ways, but ultimately, it was so important that we maintain mental health because in doing this work, and this is, again, I can tell you now because it's over, we prevented 12 different terrorist attacks, including an attack in Toronto at a gay club. And so the fact that we were able, by being on these platforms, to prevent actual attacks, including in Toronto, really made us feel so good about the work that I think it did a lot towards mitigating the kind of trauma we could have experienced if we thought, what's the point that we're doing this thing? But, so it was really important that we maintained our good health. We tried to create sort of a band of brothers feeling among the grad students. But at the end of the day, knowing that we had prevented these attacks made us feel really good about the work. And I think that really did a lot towards buoying our self-esteem and our just general attitudes about it.
Well, you've opened a door there, so I have to go through it. You've got my curiosity piqued. You say you prevented a terrorist attack in Toronto on a club. Could you, and obviously I don't want you to give up sources and methods here, but to the extent you can tell us more about that, can you tell us when, what club, and how?
I won't say which club because we actually never told the club. What had happened was I had a grad student at the time. The two of us saw that ISIS had started to organize this event It was going to be around the same time as the Pulse nightclub attack, so for the 1 year anniversary. So this was in 2017. And what happened was I caught wind of it. Ordinarily, because I am a liaison with the FBI in the United States, if I see something, I would provide the FBI the information. But it was right before a weekend, and I knew that it was going to have to go through layers and layers to get to Canada. And I was worried that I had basically 24 to 48 hours. So I contacted someone in Canada who I had met at the White House, working in countering violent extremism. They put me in touch with the RCMP, and I had the funniest conversation with a Toronto police officer who was like, "So let's back up. Why do you know this? How do you know this?" And what they did was, instead of alerting the club and causing any kind of panic, they just increased by something like 400% the number of police officers that were on the streets around the club. And so nothing ended up happening. The club didn't even know that they had been identified as a target by ISIS. We didn't panic the community. So it's great. It was the dog that didn't bark. In another instance, in Australia, and also one in the UK, the people who we identified were arrested and tried. So we know that at least among the 12, there were some cases that might have just been people who were fantasists, and they call it shit posting. But we do know that it led to actual arrests. And I can tell you that the government of Australia, the government in the UK, and even there was a threat against Barron Trump. All these things that we were able to prevent made us feel really good. And, again, I'm a really huge ally to the gay community. I have a gay cousin in Toronto. So the fact is, I felt really good that I was able to prevent a Pulse nightclub attack, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, even if it means having to go through all this horrible stuff.
And when you talk about a Pulse nightclub attack, you're essentially saying by blowing the whistle on this, you managed to prevent somebody with an automatic rifle from walking into a club and essentially shooting up and killing dozens of people. Is that right?
That was the plan, and I have to give complete credit to the RCMP and to the local Toronto Police Department, who can think that I was some crank caller, who took it seriously, who spent hours on the phone with me as I shared with them the screenshots and the information. So, they did a really great job. And the nightclub probably till this day has no idea that they were ever under threat.
That is an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. Let me ask you about the MAGA vote, the Make America Great Again vote, if I can put it that way. In the just completed Canadian election of a few months ago, got 5% of the vote. So it is not a thing in Canada in the way that it clearly is in the United States. Having said that, it exists. And I wonder if we can make that same claim about QAnon. Yes, you're quite right. It does exist in Canada. It's not a thing here in the way that it is in the United States. But what did you find about how much it has infiltrated Canada?
The thing that really surprised me is the extent to which QAnon went international and became almost like a mass movement, which is something that Sophia studies. She studies how you can have like radicalization of large Canada, and there are researchers in Canada that are focused on this, that monitor QAnon and talk about sort of the trends. So we do know that it's important to follow QAnon in Canada. Some of the most radical material that is on the QAnon Telegram channels, and because, Steve, I'm Canadian, I can hear the Canadian accent. There are a lot of Canadian women who are disseminating the propaganda. They're online talking about their experiences, talking about how the children are being sexually abused and their blood is being drained in order to keep Hollywood looking young, or in order to heal COVID-19. So what's very strange, and this is true of most conspiracies, on the one hand, they say COVID-19 is a hoax, and on the other hand, they're saying that the blood is being used to cure COVID-19. So you have basically a lot of idiosyncratic and material that seems to undermine each other. So it's not consistent. The lack of consistency is one of the hallmarks of a conspiracy theory. But what I've seen is that Justin is involved, Justin Trudeau, your prime minister. I think that the big difference is that the Conservative Party in Canada, and I give great credit to your mayor, your prime minister in Ontario. They treated COVID-19 not, and they didn't politicize it. They treated it like it was serious. If Quebec locked down, Ontario locked down, so that you didn't have this politicization of the virus. And the politicization of the virus and QAnon go hand in hand. So although I'm a hard and fast liberal, I give both the Conservative Party and the NDP and any other groups in Canada a great deal of credit for not having politicized the virus and everyone having come together, because we're in this together is something we saw in Canada. We are not seeing it in the United States.
I should actually follow up on the fact that I knew you were Canadian. I think I knew you went to McGill University as a university student, but I don't know where you're from originally. Where are you actually from in Canada?
So I'm originally from Montreal, and I'm extremely proud. My sister is a prosecutor for the Crown. So I hear about people being arrested who are QAnon, but it hasn't made as much of a big splash in Canada. What you are going to see is a lot of private violence that is very often perpetrated within the family. People who are suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, they hurt their own children because they believe the children have some sort of serpent DNA, or you'll find instances of women who have lost custody of their children. They will kidnap their own children. And part of it is the QAnon belief that creates also like an underground railroad for the women to escape with their own children. So a lot of what you'd be hearing in QAnon wouldn't be as showy as it is in the United States. You don't have like this guy, Jacob Chansley, with the face paint and the chest tattoos and the horns bellowing in Congress. But, there was an attempt outside the prime minister's residence to ram into the gates. So there is a little bit of QAnon that are crossing the lines. But, at the end of the day, QAnon hasn't been designated like other groups as a terrorist group or as a threat. So while Canada is ahead of the United States trying to clamp down on incels and voluntary celibates, and they've classified incels as terrorists, they have not yet done that with QAnon.
Okay, maybe we should finish up on this. Now that you've looked at this in such detail, do you think that there's anything that so-called normal society can do in order to push back at the unhappy influence that QAnon does have?
One of the things that I always want to make clear is that there could be people who originally start down this rabbit hole believing in QAnon because they actually think that they're helping children. And I'm going to be the first person to say, I think helping children is fantastic, but QAnon is not the way to do it. So I think a lot of people who are drawn to QAnon for what I would consider to be altruistic or good reasons can channel those good energies elsewhere. There are fabulous charities that they could actually help with. The fact is, trafficking is a problem globally, but most of the children trafficked are going to be from the global south. It's not going to be these white blonde kids that QAnon is showing. And that you should be aware that a lot of these QAnon tropes are actually rehashed anti-Semitism. So things coming from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or from Nazi materials. And I think that the more people know, the more that they will have the ballast to be able to recognize, well, wait a second, this isn't really a charity helping children. This is QAnon. For me, what I would say is diversify your sources of information. Make sure that when you see something on social media, you check it out. You don't necessarily just believe something because you read it on Facebook. And also, take breaks from your social media, from your phone, from your internet. Go for a walk. You would be surprised at how going for a walk out in nature or volunteering, if you have this incentive to help, can be a really good way of protecting yourself against QAnon.
That I believe. Mia Bloom, it is really good of you to join us again on TVO tonight. We want to remind everybody your book is called Pastels and Pedophiles, and we're delighted that it's brought you to our airwaves tonight from Atlanta, Georgia. Be well.
You too, stay healthy, stay distant, and I hope to come back to Canada soon.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.